I'm honored to be here, and I want to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me. I don't know if they've been recognized at all. Can the organizers stand up? Oh, there's several. And I wanted to also take a picture of all the great heroes that are here. Is that all right? Nobody will believe this many people came to hear me speak tonight. So I needed a picture. I have an awesome task to try to give you an overview of the Incense Road that stretched all the way from Yemen to Gaza and then through the Mediterranean to Greece, to the islands, to Italy. It is a marvelous story that has really never been told because the evidence is lacking. And the best I can do is to try to present the sporadic evidence that exists at various junctures of that route over the 10,000 miles that we're talking about. The story starts in Yemen, in South Arabia. The picture here is of the modern provinces. As you can see, the names of some of them are the same names as antiquity. Hadhramaut, there is a Marib, which is the capital of the Sabaeans. So the ancient names maintain themselves. The incense route started in Hadhramaut, the great producer of frankincense in South Arabia, the very far southern part in the Dhofar region that is pictured on this map. It is pictured here with the port cities that facilitated the trade that went by land to the west because of the great empty quarter, the Rub al-Khali, to the southeast of the peninsula that Wilfred Thesiger traveled over in the 1930s and reported in a wonderful book called Arabia Desert, I think. The royal capital of Hadhramaut was subjected to excavations by the French during the 70s and 80s. This is part of what they revealed of the capital city. The evidence seems to stretch from the second millennium all the way to the first millennium AD or CE. The complexity of the capital city is depicted here in this wonderful drawing. What this area produced was frankincense and myrrh. And this is a picture of one of the trees. They would cut the sap, and the sap would run out. They would catch the sap, and then they could put it on a fire altar and burn it. The reason that the frankincense was imported is this had two special ingredients in South Arabia that weren't present elsewhere. One was the humidity and the weather. The second was the monsoon rains. So you had the dry heat plus the wetness of the monsoon. And that caused the frankincense to be very fertile in this area. They tried to transplant the trees elsewhere, but it did not work. They were not as successful. So this became a monopoly. And it's strange that in the history of the world that Saudi Arabia, and South Arabia becomes a monopoly of oil in our modern world. And the same principle seems to be at play here. The incense was used at various incense altars stretching from South Arabia into the Mediterranean world. The Hadhramaut civilization produced these coins, as you can see, a replica of really Greek coins that they minted during the Hellenistic period. This is a depiction of some of the frankincense trees that grow in Yemen. And this is a graph to kind of show you how the incense was also produced in Somalia, in Africa, and in South Arabia. The brown area depicts the areas, and then imported up to the north on a caravan route that stretched quite some distance. The frankincense could be cut at 2 times during the year, in the fall and in the spring. So there could be 2 transports of the incense, and my argument is that one was by land and one was by sea. So we know the land route, but we don't know the sea route very well, but I'll show you some illustrations of it. Here is a depiction, the red line, of the frankincense route that ran up from South Arabia. As you see, it juts over to the west and then up to the north. There were other kingdoms that were along the South Arabian coast that it had to pass through. So we call these kingdoms the frankincense kingdoms, but frankincense was produced in Hadhramaut, then transported to Qataban, and then to the Sabaeans, and then to the Manaeans, and then north. And other kingdoms were the transporters and transmitters of the incense. And this was just part of the trade that was going on in the Indian Ocean during this time, all the way from India up to the Red Sea, through the ports on the western side of the Red Sea into Egypt, and into the Mediterranean through Alexandria, and then, of course, the land route coming north that brought it to Gaza and through the Negev. This is a depiction of Marib, the capital city of the Sabaeans. It's been excavated by the Germans over a number of years. Walter Muller was instrumental in the excavations. Sorry, am I going back? This is the ruins of Marib, stretching out. There was a great dam here that was very instrumental for the city. And we have a number of Sabaean inscriptions. There are about 100 dedicatory inscriptions, 800 building inscriptions, 200 legal texts, 1,300 graffiti, and in 1972, thousands more were discovered on wooden sticks that were used for writing purposes. These are just being translated. A host of them have been, but not many. It's a very difficult script, but some of these date back to the first millennium BC, but most of them seem to be the first millennium CE or the Common Era. So we have a great archive, but incense, strangely enough, is not mentioned in maybe but one text, so not so helpful. At Marib, a couple of Nabatean sherds were found, painted, Nabatean painted fineware, which had to be imported. And it is, as a testimony that Nabateans were in the area, but the most dramatic evidence that the Nabateans from Petra were all the way in South Arabia is this inscription, which has not really been published formally yet. Norbert Niebs in Germany published a text of it. It is a bilingual Sabaean, Nabatean Aramaic inscription. And it is clear from the Nabatean that it says, this is the stele and base that Tamu, a very common name in Nabatean, the son of Cushai, the son of Tamu, erected for Dushara. The Nabatean god was being worshipped in Yemen, in Sirwa, in the month of Tebet, in the 3rd year of Aratus, king of the Nabateans, who loves his people, in 6 BCE. So this would have been at the time of Herod the Great, and is a very interesting text that really needs to be published more formally. This is a clear depiction of the Nabatean text, and I've repeated it here, so there's no sense in reading it again for you. Then it passed to Tema, the capital of Qataban, which has also been excavated by the Americans. An American team at Johns Hopkins University worked here, and again, the evidence seems to be the 1st millennium BCE up into about the 1st century of the Common Era. And it was on the trade route. And the most dramatic evidence here for the incense route was the market code, a stele with regulations for how commerce should be handled in the city of Qataban, the capital city at Timna, and that priority would be given to the locals versus foreigners, that is, those who had colonies that were resident at Qataban, at Timna in the capital, so that the evidence seems to suggest they were trying to control the commerce going north. Then a little further to the north is the Manaean kingdom of Marquis. This is where the Manaean capital was, and the Manaeans transported, or were the great transporters of incense to the north, and they did this by creating colonies, and their colonies are well known. They're described in a number of texts. They were at Dedan, or Aula, in the northwestern part of the Arabian Peninsula. They were at Gaza. They were in Egypt. They were at Sidon in Lebanon. They were at other locations in the Levant area. This is important testimony, but they were also on the island of Delos in the Aegean Sea. So they were the great merchants of incense traveling along the route. I found a Manaean inscription east of Aqaba in 1980 and published it. So we have now maybe a half dozen or so Manaean inscriptions from that area. So very close here. I don't think any has been found here in Israel. And of course, from Yemen to the Levant is a long way. And a long way by camel caravan. So you had to have stations along the way to facilitate the trade. And this is probably the best picture with the locations of the toponyms. It's from the Atlas of Islam, Arabia in Classical Times. It was done by John Francois Saul. And he depicts the route, and I think correctly, in this. Pliny a Roman writer in the 1st century said there were 65 caravan stations from Yemen to the north, to Gaza. That's 1,487 miles. That means that there's a caravan station probably every 30 or 40 kilometers. We don't know of a single one until you get to the north. So in 2008 and 2009, I directed some excavations in this middle area, trying to find evidence of the trade. The clues that we have are very minimal. Diodorus has a sketchy account of the ethnography of Arabia. He mentions 3 or 4 tribes. Pliny lists 28 ethnic groups from the borders of Nabatea to Yemen. And that's our best insight to illuminate this trade route that must have existed at one time, on the assumption that he lists the tribes in their order geographically from the north to the south. What's interesting is Ptolemy lists 151 cities and villages in the Arabian Peninsula, which is far more than he lists for Arabia Petra, which is just 28, and 39 for Arabia Deserta. So that means that there is at least twice as many or 3 times as many cities and villages in Arabia that were known to the Romans, and they could plot them on a map with their longitude and latitude. Incorrectly, Ptolemy made a grievous mistake with his Arabian information, and they're off. So we only know relatively where they are located, but this provided at least some of the information. And a Nabatean inscription was found at Najran, just as you come out of Yemen, dated to the end of the 1st century AD, published by Michael McDonald a few years ago. So I'm just trying to give you some highlights. And the plotting of the caravan road from Najran north to Bisha, which is the major wadi that runs across this southwestern part of Saudi Arabia. The idea was by D. Magret that the route went to the east through the desert. I've traveled that desert, and it's not what I would call the most attractive route to go through this area. So we looked at the route going to the west, coming up. You see where the arrow is located, and we excavated a site in the mountains of the Asir, which would have been cooler than the desert route. If you have a caravan route, you don't want to take them through the desert if necessary, where there is lack of water and heat, but up through the mountain area. And if you look closely at this photo, you can see little white specks of villages that are located in the Asir. And at the town of Jerash, Kamis Moshe, as you come out, we excavated in 2008 an area that we knew from Yaqut, the Islamic geographer in the Middle Ages. He says that there was a northern military expedition of Tau, the South Arabian Himyarite king, and he founded a site in the ruins, which means that there had to be something there before, during this period of time, which we would date into the 5th century, so that he called this site Jerash, and that's the name that is still known by the locals. It's in the suburbs of Kamis Moshe. What we discovered here was in one of our trenches, some wavy rim bowls. We don't know their actual purpose, whether they rotated and one person sipped in one area and another in another area, but they had some kind of probably ritual function. They're very unusual, and we found remnants of them here, showing the connection to South Arabia. And also this globular jar incised with an early South Arabian letter, this letter Sin. And the god of the Hadhramauts was Sin from Mesopotamia, the moon goddess. And that may be the symbol, that they transported the pottery with the symbol of this god. We have found similar sherds like this inscribed the same way in Egypt and elsewhere. So this seems to be the index. And I showed this to Alexander Sadov in Russia, who excavated in Hadhramaut, and he said the pottery and the symbol is very clearly from Hadhramaut. So we have good evidence. Besides that, we found a few sherds of Nabatean ware depicted here at this site. So the Nabateans were moving along this route. The pilgrim route went right through this area, according to Burckhardt. So that makes good sense. So I'm arguing for that area. This is an illustration of the area of Jerash, but to the east, we did an epigraphic survey, and we found some inscriptions. You see the one here marked in white, and it's a depiction of a woman giving birth, and her name is Hayat, daughter of Minba, and that's a Sabaean name. So that this may be a Sabaean text. Then we found this text on one of the mountains. This individual says, "I am from Qataban." So now we have connections in this area with the South Arabian incense kingdoms. And finally, this Manaean text was found. This is very typical, just saying, "To the god Wad," which was the god of the Manaeans. And the incense route has been attempted to be traced by the inscriptions of Wad that have been found. And some of them have been found in northwest Arabia and in Jordan and Gaza and elsewhere. This is now moving to the northwestern part of Arabia, where there's a big gap. There seems to be two obstacles to doing anything in the western part of Saudi Arabia. They're called Medina and Mecca. No one is excavating here, and one wonders if any of the evidence has been destroyed over the years because of the pilgrims coming into that area. But in the area of Al-Ula, depicted here, in the center of the area, you see the greenery. Just north of that greenery is the site of Kareba, the ancient settlement at Al-Ula. The Don is mentioned in the prophets, Ezekiel and so forth, so well known in biblical sources. And then just north of that is Hegra, Madan Saleh, which has been subjected to a excavation by the French over the last, since about 2003, currently up till now. It has a number of tombs like those at Petra. This is one of my favorites, just cut out of the rock, showing that there's no depth to it. It's just a facade, but nicely done. And the excavations of the French are depicted in this slide, as you can see, on each side. And a few years ago, 2009, this Latin inscription from Hegra was found, indicating that the people at Hegra had been integrated into the Roman Empire and that they were citizens of the Roman Empire. It is the first explicit testimony of this. And, I'm going back again. And this is a depiction of a wall that encircled the community at Hegra. And in the southern area was a legionary camp in the 2nd century. So that caravans coming from the south would interact or be intervened by a Roman troop that was located here. This rampart was constructed probably in the 1st century, 2nd century CE. And there are 5 gates to it, and more than 30 Latin inscriptions were found. The most important was dated to 175 to 177, just before Septimius Severus. Units were stationed here of different nature, but legionary units, stationarii, dromedarii, which indicates that they were professional units that were used for transporting goods. This is one of 2 Latin inscriptions that was found. You can see here that it is of the 3rd Cyrenaic Legion. Francois Villeneuve. I'm sorry. I want to move now a little further north. This is an area just to the north of Hegra where 1,000 inscriptions have recently been published in 2018. 913 of them are Nabatean inscriptions. And this route has been called the Dard al-Bakra, the highway of the camel. Bakra was a term that was used in Talmudic inscriptions to designate the camel. My eyes are not great, so bear with me. Got it. This shows the route with all of the inscriptions, some of the stations along the route that were used for transporting incense. This is between Tabuk and Hegra. Tabuk is just south of the Jordanian border in a major area. This is the Dard al-Bakra publication. And this is a depiction of some of the rock art that was found here. I'm just selecting a few pictures. There's many, many pictures here. And here's a South Arabian text that was discovered in the area, and a Nabatean inscription. We have a list of Nabatean sites where they have been found. There's something like, 15 sites or so. And this lists the number of inscriptions. You see the total of 912. I said 913. I'll go back to Saudi Arabia and put another one in, so it's 913. Don't worry about it. Okay? And what these inscriptions designate, and this is the important thing, is a governor, a hipparch who's in charge of the cavalry, a centurion in charge of 1,000 men, a guard, a gatekeeper. So you have a number of ingredients for the route. And there are a number of ethnic groups that are mentioned. There are several Moabites. We know they're Moabites because they designate themselves. I'm a Moabite. There are several Hegrites. And there is one Jewish inscription. Uzi Avner has looked at these texts and he thinks he's seen a few names I haven't done. a onomasticon yet of this area study of it, but I'm sure there's probably more. But one individual does say, "I am a Jew." The dates of these inscriptions, we only have 7 or 8 dates. Only one of them dates before the annexation of the Nabatean kingdom. The other 6 date to after the 2nd and 3rd century, which would fit the Septimius Severus information. And now by the sea. This is the most remarkable discovery. On the Khorasan Islands in the Red Sea, to the far south, as you can see near Himyar in the Arabian Peninsula, some Latin inscriptions were found. But after that, some South Arabian inscriptions were found. So we believe this island was connected to sea trade, coming through the Red Sea up to the north to ports. And a stone anchor was found of antiquity on the island as well. The most remarkable publication was a Sabaean text of a 2,000-mile journey from Saba, the Sabaean area, to the north and Gaza. It was published in 2009 by Francois Braun and André Lemaire. It indicates that this individual was on a commercial trip that took him to the Don, to Gaza, and what's more important? The villages of Judah. The villages of Judah. And the date of this inscription is around 600 BC. And what's interesting is when excavations took place in Jerusalem, back in the 70s and 80s, some South Arabian inscriptions were found at Jerusalem. And they have been found in the Negev as well. They date to about the same period of time. And the interesting thing about these inscriptions is they're on local pottery, which indicates that the Sabaeans had to have been resident in Jerusalem in the time before the destruction of the temple in 586. And this is the journey that this person took to the north. I won't spend any time with it. And their Latin inscriptions that were found here were found in this area of the Khorasan Islands. I'm trying to move quickly before Yigal takes the hook. This is the Latin inscription, well published. And you notice that the Khorasan Islands are mentioned in the second line from the bottom, the Khorasan Islands. And that this was considered the port of Hercules, who separated the Red Sea from Africa, according to Greek mythology. This is a depiction of the text. And another secondary text was found of the 6th Verata. The other legion seems to be from Egypt. This one would have been from Arabia, probably at the early part of the 2nd century, so that we have this activity. Going north, there are 2 port cities that I'll end with. One is to the south at Al-Waj, and the other one to the north, Al-Guna. And this is the map from Al-Waj going to Hegra, just to the south. And this is where Richard Burton in the 19th century found a temple that was excavated. It is now thought to be a triclinium, not a temple. And this is some of the remains of it that have recently been published. And the Nabatean capital found at the site. And And this is a depiction of the temple or the triclinium at the, in the Riyadh Museum. Some of the pottery was Nabatean and imported Italian ware as well. So they thought that this far southern part was maybe one of the vital trade routes. I conclude with Iuna. This is a site that has recently been excavated by the Polish in the last few years. Iuna is in the Gulf to the right. As you come through the Gulf of Aqaba, you go to the right, and there is a settlement along the shore. This is the settlement. It has an upper and lower segment. The upper part is on a mountain, on a plateau. It has not been excavated yet, just surveyed. Lower Iuna has been excavated. This is what it looked like in 1960 from a photograph. And this is an aerial view. And as you can see, there's one large area that may have been an administrative area, and then a number of buildings and structures alongside that must have been for storage. And the pottery here is very poorly preserved. There are 28 coins, Nabatean, I'll quit in 2 minutes. 14 coins are primarily 2nd and 1st century BCE, with a later one of Aristos IV. For the Roman period, only one on Elagabalus. And the argument is this may be the area of Leucomene, the port city that brought incense inland and then to the north on a caravan route. And this is the incense route to Avdat and then to Gaza.